with the Russian Revolution as our creative inspiration. We start tonight with two writers from Russia, originally, who have taken very, very different paths in their lives. So first of all, I'd like to invite Boris AKUNIN. Now, this is the embarrassing bit where I tell you what you already know about yourself. Now, Boris AKUNIN is not actually called Boris AKUNIN, and we don't even know whether he's written his books. His wife might have written them, which is another story. But he can tell us all about that. Anyway, Boris is genuinely one of my favourite crime writers in the world. You didn't think Russia had crime writers? Russia has crime. It has a crime writer. It has a few... Does Russia have crime? Anyway, so Boris is famous as Russia's leading detective and crime writer. He also writes what he calls serious literary novels, as well as essays, history, and plays. His recent multi-volume, everything Boris does is multi-volume, popular history project entitled History of the Russian State is the translation, combines both non-fiction and fiction. He's always trying different things with his writing, which is why it's so wonderful. His books have sold over 30 million copies in Russia alone. 30 million? He's famous. He's really famous. And are translated into almost 50 languages. And several of his books have been made into TV series and films as well. So welcome to the creator of Erast Fandorin, the 19th century St. Petersburg spy and detective. Welcome to Boris AKUNIN.
Good evening, Rosie. Good evening, everybody.
Now, you're going to give us your little manifesto. You've got...
I'm going to read a little piece, which I wrote specially for this evening. It is about what the October Revolution means to me. Now I'm going to take my manuscript. For me, the October Revolution was my grandmother. Do you know what the word association game is? You are given a random word and then asked to name the first thing that springs to your mind associated with that word. Usually it is something not directly related to the word, often something quite unexpected. So, if you approached me from behind and yelled in my ear, "Boo! Revolution!" I would see immediately the wrinkled face of my grandmother. She was an old Bolshevik, as they were called, a veteran of the revolution. I grew up listening to her tales of 1917 and the Civil War. There was nothing heroic about those tales, and most of them weren't even suited for kids' ears. But Granny was a real hardcore Bolshevik. She made no concessions to one's age. For example, there was an unforgettable story which haunted me long afterwards. A story about Granny's first kiss. It was 1920, the Kuban front. She and my future grandfather were riding horses side by side. Granny had to lean from the saddle for the kiss, and her false teeth came off. She had lost all her teeth due to scurvy during the famine of 1918. It is a real wonder that my mother was born 9 months later, and that, as a consequence, I exist at all. My grandfather, whom I never knew, must have been a really brave person. A lot of Granny's revolution tales were less hilarious. Something I never heard in the Soviet schools' history lessons. Like how they were fighting white Cossack partisans in the Northern Caucasus. And the only way to suppress the opposition was to take hostages and start shooting them one by one. Then the partisans would surrender. Or how the Cossacks ambushed Granny's platoon while she was luckily away on an errand. All those taken alive were mutilated and killed. Everything that could be chopped off one's body was chopped off, Granny said, and pointed her finger at my body to specify what exactly she meant, making me shudder. If I wanted, I could touch history. It was a piece of shrapnel stuck in Granny's elbow since 1919. And by the age of 6 or 7, I already had a very clear idea of what the revolution was about. The greatest luck that befell our motherland, Granny would say. And for her it was. She grew up an orphan, a Cinderella without a fairy and a prince, lonely, underfed and abused. The first thing she did after the revolution was to learn how to read and write. 10 years later, she became one of the first women to study at the Air Force Academy. So she knew what she was fighting for. On the anniversary of the revolution, November the 7th, I would always be at Granny's, my parents having fun somewhere else. Granny celebrated the great event with her comrades, old Bolsheviks like herself. They were all single ladies. The men they had loved, married, had children with, had been long dead. Revolution eats its children, Danton said. Especially sons, it might be added. None of the husbands survived all the wars and purges, and what surprised me as a kid, those men were never remembered at those gatherings. The old ladies weren't sentimental. Sometimes they'd quarrel about who joined the party first. It was important. There was a whole hierarchy based on party membership seniority. The year and even the month of joining was like a nickname. The most respected and envied matriarch, a tiny deaf witch, was a revered December 1915, my grandmother being only March 1918, Junior League. Food at Granny's Revolution feasts was awful, as no one of the old girls had any interest in cooking. I'd whine, "Granny, I hate this fish of yours." She'd answer, "Keep hatred for the enemies of the party. Just open your mouth and be done with it." They understood and cherished enmity. They did. Grandmother's former best friend from the Civil War, Aunt Rosa, as she was known to me, wasn't on speaking terms with Granny since 1931, when they quarreled over an ideological issue. Aunt Rosa would have her own parties, where I went to in secret because there the food was delicious. She was a cabinet minister's widow with a taste for good living. I remember how I was visiting Granny on her deathbed in the old Bolsheviks hospital. On the other side of the wall, in the next room, literally 1 meter away, Aunt Rosa was dying. I was shuttling between the rooms trying to reconcile them while they were still breathing. Finally, I came to my grandmother and lied that Rosa forgave her. "Not I," whispered Granny. I attended their respective funerals with a several days interval. It was 1979. Revolution and Granny's youth seemed totally prehistoric. But writing this little text, I suddenly realized that when I, as a kid, was listening to Granny's tales of revolution, she was about the same age as I am now. So for her, it would be like for me now to recall the trivia of my college years in 1970s. Say, how queer it was to prepare for the exam on Marxism-Leninism with the Pink Floyd playing in my headphones. So, not such ancient history, the October Revolution. Not for me. Thank you.
That's quite a story. Thank you very much. And that's just, that's an exclusive, I think. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Boris.